Well, Vicky just introduced the theme of our conversation this morning, beyond ethical compliance, the challenge of building ethical culture in organizations. And she also mentioned that I'm an expert in organizational ethics and also in the ethical dimensions of corporate governance. And given that role that I play, I often get people engaging me around ethics. And there are two things that sort of stand out for me of what people like to share with me. The first one is that people like to tell me what it really is out like there. In other words, what is happening in the real world out there. And then they start telling me all types of war stories and just horrible tales of how corrupt people are and how unethical they are. So I'm really well informed. I can tell you about what is going wrong in the world. But then sometimes people also offer me advice on how this problem should be fixed. And prominent amongst what people share with me is always the word consequence management. And the solution more or less goes like this, that what you should do is you should issue a code of ethics and ethics policies, make people to sign for it, and then encourage them or even threaten them to report whenever they see something wrong. You can even say that it is misconduct if you don't report unethical behavior that you observed. You provide them with a whistleblowing line, and then when anything is uncovered, you come down like a ton of bricks on whoever committed some misdemeanor. And then they think this will lead to an ethical culture in your organization. Well, I'm afraid that does not quite match with my experience. My experience is that you don't build an ethical culture by focusing on what you do not want. You only get what you want if you focus on what you do want. Or to say it in a different manner, as we saw in the SALTS review, Dan Pink in a TED talk also said the same, that there is a disconnect between what science know and what business does. And this is to a large extent that I would like to discuss with you this morning. But as always in all my ethics talks, I always start at the beginning, making sure that we all understand what we mean by ethics. Because my experience is if I don't do this, you will anyway interrupt me within the first 5 minutes to say, okay, so what do you mean by ethics? So let me tell you what I mean by ethics and also what I mean by organizational ethics. And there in front of you, you can see the triangle of the self, the good, and the other, implying that one is ethical when you don't only consider what is good for yourself, but when you also balance that with what is good for others. In other words, ethics is always about a certain quality of interaction between myself and other people. And the quality of that interaction is that the interaction should not only be good for me, but also good for those affected by it. And I think this is very nicely captured in what we are all familiar with, which is called the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule says, always do good unto others as you expect others to do good unto yourself. And this Golden Rule we find right across the world in all cultures, in all religions, also in most moral philosophies, we would find the same. But what we are interested in is not only individual or personal ethics, but we are interested specifically in organizational ethics. And here, I want us to look at the King IV definition of organizational ethics. It says that in the context of organizations, ethics refers to ethical values applied to decision-making, conduct, and the relationship between the organization, its stakeholders, and the broader society. And I hope you can see our triangle of the self, the good, and the other very nicely returning here, because your ethical values is understanding of what is good, right, acceptable. That the organization, which is now the we, not the I, the collective self, apply in its decision-making, its conduct, and its relationships with the other, which are now the stakeholders and the broader society. Okay, so that just by way of opening up our conversation and getting us all on the same page. And I see that there's already 2 comments in the Q&A. Fakili saying, building an ethical culture is a journey. Can you point us to a framework to save and guide in the journey? Fakili, I'm very glad to say that that is exactly my agenda for the morning. I will provide you with the framework that you use for that specific journey. Okay, then I also see that Michael says there's an increasing disconnect between building ethical culture within an organization when our society and political leadership is deeply corrupt and deepening in dysfunction. How do organizations have these conversations? Okay, Michael, I hope that by the end of our talk this morning, we will have addressed that. If we haven't, please alert me to the fact. So, but I agree with your sentiment that there is a disconnect between what is happening in our societies and the focus on building an ethical culture. But let's move to that. So moving on to how not to do it. Let's take this example, and this is an extract from the corporate governance report of Steinhoff. You all are very, very familiar with Steinhoff, and the University of Stellenbosch Business School published 2 years ago a special report that they called the Steinhoff Saga, which you can see, you can download from that website. But I want to show you just one sentence that I extracted from the Steinhoff Corporate Governance Report in 2011. And what that sentence says is that Steinhoff has not established a formal process for obtaining assurance on ethical awareness and ethical compliance throughout the group. The underlining is mine. So in plain English, they basically said, we can give you no assurance that, number one, people in our organization are aware of our ethical standards, nor can we give you any assurance that people abide by, in other words, that there's ethical compliance with our standards. And I think this is a nice, frank and honest admission, and they can be commended for being so honest and open about this. And surely in the 2012 report, we would have expected them saying, we have now started a process and at least we can give you assurance that everyone is aware of our ethical standards. But I think you can guess what happened. We find the very same sentence unaltered in the 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016 report. And as you all know, 2017 is the year when the Steinhoff scandal broke. So the moral of the story is, if you do nothing about your ethics, don't expect something to happen. If you want to build an ethical culture, there's some hard work for you to do. As Fakili said, it's quite a journey that we should go on. And I want to take you through that journey. But let's start with King 4, because I think we get very appropriate guidance in King 4 when it comes to ethics. And just to remind you that the King 4 report says that when you govern any entity, irrespective of whether it is a for-profit, a non-profit, a listed, a non-listed entity, you always have 4 basic governance responsibilities. You have to set strategy for the organization so that it can fulfill its purpose. You have to approve policies that provide the borders, the guidelines within which you can execute your strategy. You need to exercise oversight of the performance. In other words, are we delivering on our promise, on our strategic objectives, and do we do so in a responsible, legal, and ethical manner? And then finally, you have to report and disclose your performance to your stakeholders. But then the unique contribution of King 4 is that it says, governance is not about ticking these 4 boxes. You can't say that you've governed well if you tick the box of strategy, policy, oversight, and disclosure. What you should do is to check whether you deliver the following 4 outcomes. And there you can see the first outcome is the ethical culture. In other words, if you govern well, the consequence of governing well is the establishment of an ethical culture. Those are one of the 4 major outcomes. The second one is good performance, that is defined as sustained value creation for all your stakeholders. The third one is an effective control environment where you protect the assets entrusted to you and manage your risks. And the final one is that you enjoy legitimacy. In other words, you are trusted by your stakeholders and you have a good reputation in society. So you can see already in the very core of good governance, we see ethical culture. Now, there's an interesting shift between King 3 and King 4, but let me start with King 4. And in the second principle of King 4, it says, the governing body should govern the ethics of the organization in a way that supports the establishment of an ethical culture. Okay, so you should govern ethics, which means a strategy for ethics, ethics-related policies, oversight of ethics performance, and then also reporting and disclosing your ethics performance to your stakeholders. What did King 3 say? King 3 also had a similar principle, but look at the wording of it. Principle 1.3 in King 3 2009 said, the board should ensure that the company's ethics is managed effectively. Can you see the difference in emphasis? In King 3, the emphasis was on ethics management. Do we have a code? Do we communicate our ethical standards? Do we train people on our standards? Do we monitor compliance to our ethical standards? Can you see these are all boxes that you can tick and say, yes, I am indeed managing my ethics. King 4 says, so what? What's the outcome of that process? And you can see the shift to ethical culture. In other words, King 4, I think, is a major step forward in saying, what you should worry about is not your processes. Of course, they are important. And your initiatives, and your codes, and your policies. Yes, all of them are important. But the proof of the pudding lies in the eating. In other words, it lies in the culture. Does all of that contribute to cultivating an ethical culture in your organization? And let's just be clear by what we mean by culture in general, but also ethical culture more specifically. In the results review that was commissioned by Barclays after the interbank lending rate scandal, in this independent review, Barclays was reminded that the solution does not lie in more regulation and more compliance. They said they have enough of that, but in culture. And then they define culture as the social and unwritten rules with regard to how people in groups interact. And I like that last part, the collective habits. Culture refers to habits that we develop over time. It also defines culture as the shared patterns of thinking, responding, and interpreting. In other words, we develop certain habits of when something happens, how do we respond to it? How do we think about it? How do we make sense of it? I always say it's important to understand that culture is built incident by incident. Culture is built by how we respond to good and bad things that happen in our organization. And of course, leadership example is all important. The way in which leaders respond, in other words, how they think, how they react, how they interpret good and bad things happening to the organization, ultimately leads to the cultivation of these habits in our organization. And just to show you that it's not unique to the King report to see the shift to culture, In other words, moving beyond just compliance, ticking the boxes of ethics management, moving on to something much deeper, much more transformational. Here's a report that was brought out by the G30, which are the 30 biggest financial institutions in the world, and they called it Banking Conduct and Culture. And the opening sentence of that report is quite telling when it says, banks and banking rely on trust. And while trust takes years to establish, it can be lost in a moment through failures caused by problematic ethics, values, and behavior. And you can see, once again, also in the banking environment, a realization that if we want to build trust in our organizations, we need to move beyond compliance to ethical values and ethical conduct. And I'm glad to say that also in the field of organizational ethics or business ethics, if you look at the field globally where we are moving, there's a big shift towards behavioral ethics. In other words, understanding how people behave in organizational settings. Now, just to show you the link between culture and conduct, because your culture will determine how people behave themselves in your organization. And I just want to show you two examples of what we found in a survey that we did last year, the South African Business Ethics Survey, which is a survey amongst 20 large and listed companies in South Africa. And we asked our respondents, have you observed unethical conduct over the last 12 months? And what we did then was to analyze the responses that we get in terms of what did people in companies with weak or poor ethical culture say, and what did people in companies with strong ethical cultures said about have they observed unethical conduct over the last year. And there you can see it, the red bar on the left, you can see that almost 6 out of 10 people in companies with poor ethical cultures said we observed unethical conduct in our company over the last year, while only about 1 in 4 people said the same in companies with strong ethical cultures. Now, I think this is quite telling to see the direct correlation between the strength of your ethical culture and the manifestation of unethical conduct. But we then followed it up with a second question and asked these very same people and then analyzed the responses again. So that conduct that you observed, did you report that to the relevant authority in your company? And here we see the exact opposite, that although there were high incidences of unethical conduct in companies with a poor ethical culture, there was a relatively low reporting rate. While exactly the opposite happened in companies with strong ethical cultures, where there were a low level of incidences of unethical behavior, but a much higher reporting of unethical behavior. And I think this really proves the point, why it is important to move beyond just ticking the boxes for your ethics management program, but start focusing on managing your ethics, governing your ethics in a way that supports the development of an ethical culture. Okay, when it comes to ethical culture, we typically get 2 types of ethical culture in organizations. The one is what I call companies where people do the right thing as long as somebody is watching. In other words, it's a culture driven by extrinsic motivation. I will do the right thing if someone watches me. But what happens if nobody is watching? That, of course, is the big question. Typical in these cultures, doing the right thing when somebody is watching, the emphasis is on preventing unethical behavior. So you focus on what you don't want in the organization. And the approach is very often a so-called zero tolerance approach. In other words, in zero tolerance, you can hear it's a fear-based approach. Try me, step over the line, 1 strike and you're out. And the emphasis then is put on catching those who do wrong. Now, I'm not knocking this. Very often this is an appropriate response, but there is a downside to this. And the downside to this is what I said before: what happens if nobody is watching? And secondly, it can easily create a mentality that says what is not forbidden is allowed. And that is problematic, because the danger is that you can dumb people down, that you can stop them from thinking. And therefore, the other type of culture, which I know we all agree is the ideal, is the one that is based on intrinsic motivation. In other words, we do the right thing not because somebody is watching. We do the right thing even when nobody is watching. But for this type of culture to take shape, it is important that we shift our focus from preventing unethical behavior to promoting ethical responsibility, and that we get people to do the right thing out of conviction and not out of fear. And the integral part of this approach is that you shift your focus to catching those who do right. In other words, when you see the right type of conduct, the right type of attitude, the right type of behavior, that you zoom in on that and that you say, wow, this is what we are looking for. You reinforce that, you give those type of behaviors more airtime. And I think going back to the theme of our conversation this morning, moving beyond compliance to building an ethical culture, the distinction between these two types of ethical culture is all important. You see, the big problem of extrinsically motivated ethical behavior, doing the right thing as long as somebody is watching, and especially if it's coupled with fear-based compliance, was once again in the SALT's review highlighted when the report reminds us that extrinsic motivation dulls creativity, narrows focus, and slows down problem solving. More worrying, fear-driven compliant behavior undermines doing the right thing. So ironically, despite your best intentions, by allowing that you, announcing that you have a zero tolerance culture and that you will fearlessly pursue any transgressors, it might end up in the opposite, that it actually makes people less responsible over time because they stop thinking. So therefore, it is very important that while on the one hand, yes, we never turn a blind eye to unethical conduct and we come down on it visibly and audibly, it is important to also have the aspect of bringing some of your commitment to ethical organization into the hearts and minds of your people. And this is the framework that I refer to, that I will introduce. This is the framework that we use with all organizations that we work with at the Ethics Institute. And we say the outcome of our engagement around ethics is culture. And therefore you can see right in the background there sits the outcome of culture. But we can't work directly on culture because it's an outcome. Where do we start? We always start with leadership commitment. If you don't have committed leaders that visibly and audibly support your ethics in the organization, you're in deep trouble. The second thing that you need is for your governance structures. In other words, a board of directors or whatever other governing body you have to play their governance role. In other words, set ethics strategy, approve ethics policies, exercise oversight of ethics performance in the organization, and ultimately also to report and disclose that to your stakeholders. But these governance structures, typically like a social and ethics committee, are quite blind. They don't know what is happening on a day-to-day basis, and therefore something first needs to happen in the organization that can be reported to them. Otherwise, they can't play their oversight role. So therefore, it is important that you have someone in the organization responsible for the management of ethics in the organization. We call that your ethics manager, your ethics officer. And that ethics management function have 5 main things to do. First of all, they need to do a proper scientific ethics risk assessment. What are we getting right? What are we getting wrong? Based on that, they can then formulate an ethics strategy that is then translated into an ethics management plan. Then they need to make sure that there's clarity on the standards, the relevant standards, given our ethics risk profile, given the industry and the country in which we operate. And those standards come in the form of a code of ethics, a code of conduct, a conflict of interest policy, a gift policy, whatever other ethics-related policies. And then the big job of institutionalization starts. In other words, how do we make these words on paper real? And here it's really about, first of all, making sure that people are familiar with your ethical standards. Secondly, it's about encouraging people to abide by the standards. And here we need to make a decision. Are we going to threaten our people with a fear-based tactic into adhering to our ethical standards, or are we going to use much more of a value-based approach where we try to convince them that these standards are appropriate and right and in the interest of not only us but all our stakeholders? And then finally, you need to monitor what is happening in terms of unethical incidents or adherence to ethical standards. And this gives you something to report back to your governance structures. Finally, it's about the independent assessment and external reporting of your whole ethics program, typically where internal audit function would make an assessment of the adequacy and effectiveness of your ethics program, and then report that to your governing structures, your audit committee, your social and ethics committee, who will then also report externally on the ethics performance. So let me wrap up by saying, what are the things that really matter when it comes to building an ethical culture? But more so, what are the main things that signal the maturity of your ethical culture? And I use the insights that we have gained from our ethical culture maturity indicator instrument that we developed, standardized, and use in organizations. And I put them in a very specific order because we ran a dominance analysis on these 7 factors that gives you an indication of what matters most when it comes to measuring the strength of your ethical culture. And the first thing is ethics, accountability, and responsibility. In other words, are there consequences? Are people given ethical responsibilities, and are there consequences if you adhere or if you don't adhere? And please note, I say positive consequences and negative consequences, not only negative consequences. Closely followed by top leadership commitment to ethics. We all know that tone at the top matters, and these 2 things, plus the third one, are very closely aligned. We find that these are the top 3 indicators of the strength of your culture. The third one being middle management commitment to ethics. Does not help that you have top management commitment, but it does not cascade down to middle management. They often can become a barrier to that ethical intention flowing down to your organization. Then the fourth factor is awareness of ethical standards. The fifth one is ethical treatment of staff and stakeholders. Do we treat people with respect and in a fair manner? The sixth one is employee commitment to ethics. And the last one is the prevalence of ethics talk in your organization. Okay, so with that, it's the presentation. I think there are quite a number or quite some activity in the Q&A. Lalita, your question, starting with that. Is ethics about sacrificing all self-interest? As you might have heard, my background is in philosophy, and one of my favorite philosophers is a man by the name of Alistair McIntyre. And Alistair McIntyre says, self-sacrifice is as much a vice as selfishness. In other words, ethics is not about self-sacrifice. It's about self-discipline. It's about finding the sweet spot, the balance between what is good for me and what is good for others. And therefore, you can see that there was the triangle of the self, the good, and the other, and it's about finding the balance. Self-sacrifice can be as wrong as selfishness. Okay. How do you go about measuring or establishing whether you have established an ethical culture? That's the question from Rob Figor. Very important question. I do a lot of work with social and ethics committees, also sit on social and ethics committees. And you might know that when it comes to social and ethics committees, if we look at the statutory mandate of that committee, the word ethics only appears in the title of the committee and never in the mandate of the committee. So ironically, the Social and Ethics Committee does not have a governance of ethics mandate, in the sense that we discussed it this morning and in the sense that Principle 2 of King 4 talks about that. King 4 tried to correct that under Principle 8 of King 4 that deals with the subcommittees of the governing body. When it comes to the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee, the first thing that is said about the mandate is that the committee should oversee and report on organizational ethics. In other words, now King 4 tried to correct what was missing from the Companies Act and Companies Regulations. Now, if you read that mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee to also govern organizational ethics, along with Principle 2 that says you should govern the ethics in a manner that supports the development of an ethical culture, you need to be in a position to say something about the maturity or the strength of your ethical culture. And in my experience working with social and ethics committees, most of them are in the dark when I ask them, so how do you monitor the strength of your ethical culture? And that is why we find it important that we do measure that. And I've shown you the factors, for example, that we look at in our ethical culture maturity indicator. By the way, it's also the same instrument that we used in that South African business ethics survey that I showed you the two findings earlier on. Comment: consider earning trust since it is foundational to building trust. Well, it is Ven who said that, and Ven, I'm most thankful to you for raising this, because there's a very intimate link between your ethics and your ethics performance, more specifically, and trust in the organization. There was a very interesting study released at the World Economic Forum in Davos at the beginning of this year when there were still social gatherings. It's called the Edelman's Trust Barometer. And in that Edelman Trust Barometer that is published on an annual basis, there was an interesting new dimension. They surveyed 40 multinational companies around the world and asked them, on what is your experience in terms of why people trust you? In other words, what does your trust capital consist of? And there were a very clear trend that came out of the responses. Companies said, our trust depends mainly on two things: competency and ethics. Competency they defined as the ability to deliver on your promises. Ethics they defined as running an ethical organization and being of benefit to your society. And then they said, okay, fine. You say competency and trust are the two factors that determine your so-called trust capital. What percentage of each contribute to your trust? And there was an astonishing finding that companies, remember, these are not ethicists, not people like me. It is CEOs of companies said 76%, in other words, 3/4 of the trust that people have in us depend on our ethics. The remaining 24% on our competence. So I think this is really telling. Okay, then we have Lalita saying, is the integrated report based on, I suppose that is GRI and GRI G4 sustainability reporting framework, or is it based on King 4? No, the integrated report is something different from a sustainability report. The big problem that happened globally was that people started publishing two reports: a financial report that tells the story about the financial position and health of the organization, and a sustainability report that tells about the impact of the organization, basically on the triple context of the economy, the society, and the natural environment. And then there was a call that these two reports should not be isolated from one another. They should be integrated. It should become one story that tells the story of the impact of your financial performance on the so-called 6 capitals of the integrated reporting framework. In other words, on your financial capital, your manufactured capital, your intellectual capital, your human capital, your social and relationship capital, and your natural capital, to tell one story and not two separate stories. And what King 4 recommends and encourages organizations is not to tell two separate stories, but to tell the integrated story of how are we affected by our 6 capitals and by our stakeholders, but also how do we affect all our capitals and all our stakeholders. Okay, then,
sorry
yes.
to interrupt you. I've put a comment in the chat box. If anyone would like to ask a question live, they can raise their hand. And I do have Paco who has raised his hand. So can I allow him to ask his question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Paco, if you can unmute your mic and you can ask your question live. Paco, are you winning with unmuting? There we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. I would like to say the issue of ethics, I realize my experience is that it's only dealt with, or it's the consensus of the technocrats. When you go to the political arena, you find that that section is the one that lets us down. And a good case where this manifests in state-owned enterprises, where you even find that people are not at the step when they try to build spirit of ethics and others. What's your comment on that, sir?
Thank you, Paku. The audio wasn't quite clear, but I think I followed more or less what you said, where you said you are concerned about a lack of ethics and a lack of ethics commitment in the public sector. And I think I also heard you mention state-owned enterprises. And unfortunately, I have to agree with you. In terms of the analyses that we do, in terms of the maturity of ethical culture, we find that the most mature ethical culture that we come across is in the private sector. So the private sector are doing a bit better. This is also reflected in that Edelman's trust barometer, that people in South Africa have more trust in the private sector than they have in the public sector or in state-owned entities. So our research shows us that ethical culture is less mature in the public sector and also in the state-owned enterprises sector. And this once again is reflected in the Edelman's Trust Barometer. If you go to the findings of that, you would see that the trust in the public sector is much lower than in the business sector. But what I think is most disconcerting is that of all the countries that participated in that specific trust barometer, South Africa has done the worst. The trust in our public sector is half of the global average of companies who did that. And I think important once again to link this also with ethics and to link this with the manifestation of corruption that we see in the public sector. In my mind, I would add a third factor that adds to the trust that we have in organizations and specifically in the public sector. I totally agree. Competence is important. I, of course, very strongly agree that ethics is all important. But you can, of course, include honesty as a subdivision or openness as a subdivision of ethics. But I believe it is important that openness about what is happening, not sweeping things under the carpet, admitting mistakes, is a big part of recovering that trust. Okay, Vicky, are there more hands up, or should I continue with what is in the Q&A box?
I think maybe continue. I see Harold has put his hand. Okay, now Harold's put his hand down, so there's no more hands up, Deon.
Okay, good. So let's take the one by Fakile that says, if an organization does not have a social and ethics committee, which other board committee is placed to have oversight of the ethics program? Great question. Remember what happened now with King. In the case of the Companies Act and the companies regulations, it said the companies that should have social and ethics committees are three categories of companies: all state-owned companies, all listed companies. In other words, if you are listed on one of our stock exchanges, you must have it. Or if you are a so-called public interest company, your public interest score is higher than 500 points. And the rest aren't required to have social and ethics committees. But what King said is, your ethics performance is of strategic importance. Your ethics can sink you as an organization, and we've seen many examples of that. And therefore, they say all organizations should govern not only their ethics, but also their social performance, which King refers to as your responsible corporate citizenship. And King says, does not matter in which category of company or which category of organization you fall, whether you are listed or not listed, whether you are large or small, whether you are for-profit or not for-profit, your ethics and your social citizenship matters, and it is of strategic importance, and therefore you should attend to this. But King, typically of the approach that was followed in the King 4 report, did not try to be prescriptive and said, look at yourself as an organization. Is this a responsibility that you want your governing body itself to take on? Do you want to establish a specialized social and ethics committee, or do you want to give this to another committee, another existing committee? So what matters is the matter and not the form. In other words, what matters is that you do attend to organizational ethics and to your impact on the economy, the society, and the natural environment, and that you govern that. No size fits all, in other words. Marcus asked, how do you implement this when an organization has entrenched institutional poor governance and possible wrongdoing? Well, I think you've seen where it starts. It starts at the top. If you want to change that, it all starts with leadership. And Marcus, I think what I hear you say between the line is, what do you do if you don't find it at the top? And as I said, then you are in deep trouble. And you need to see what you can do in order to ignite that flame, in order to get people to start taking this seriously. And very often it is finding the right language. What language do leaders understand that this is important? Is it the language of scandal? Is it the language of reputation? Is it the language of risk? Is it the language of being a purposeful organization that makes a meaningful difference? So there are different languages that we can speak and try to get the ear of the people. But unless you get that commitment at the top, it is very hard to get this going and to respond to this. Okay, I think I dealt with Tumelu's question about why should non-profits have social and ethics committee. I'm the CEO of a non-profit organization. If something goes wrong with our ethics, we are gone. We are literally gone. And if we are seen as not being a responsible member of society, we are in deep trouble. So even non-profits need that. Then Marina asked, is it possible to change the ethical culture of a country? Yes, it is. Anything can change. There's nothing that can't change. The future is not a continuation of the past. It is possible for a Nazi Germany to turn into a totally different type of organization or a different type of company or country. And we've seen it, but it won't happen automatically. Those things that I listed for you on my last slide, what are the crucial factors? In other words, is there responsibility for ethics and accountability for ethics, both in the positive and the negative sense? And the second important thing, do we see visible and audible leadership commitment? These things matters. If they are there, it can happen. I work in a field where I see this on a daily basis. Then there's a question, and Vicky, you should stop me if you think we are running out of time. Can I take one or two more questions?
Yes, Deon, we still have enough time. It's only 10 to 10, and I do have two more members that have got their hands raised. So I think once you've done a few questions, when you're ready, I can ask them to answer them.
Okay, let me take two questions here, and then we take another two questions from the hands that were raised. Question says, am I correct in concluding that ethics in a small business enterprise starts with the leader owner and get filtered down to staff? Absolutely spot on. That is where it always starts. And you would see in the framework that I shared with you on how do you build that ethical culture, we start at the top, leadership commitment. And by the way, ethics is as important for the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, if I can quote Adam Smith, as it is for the Barlow Worlds and the APSAs and whatever other big mining company you can think of. Your sustainability as a SME, like all other organizations, depends on whether people trust you and trust your product. And we've already seen the prominent role that ethics plays in cultivating that trust. Then, Jashwan, a very interesting question. Why is it easy to talk about ethics at home and not so easy at the work environment where we even need policies to regulate? On Monday morning this week, we had an event at the Ethics Institute, and this became the main focus of our conversation. And we often find that people would say, no, but everyone in this country is corrupt. The story was told by a CEO who went into a new country, became the CEO there in one of our neighboring countries, started talking ethics in the organization. One of his employees came to him and said, sorry, sir, this is a corrupt country. All people are corrupt here. And then he said to him, are you sure? Tell me a bit about your family. Do people care for one another? Do they care for visitors? Do they show respect to older people. He says, yes, of course, we are decent people. He says, so how can you say the whole country is corrupt? And I think this is a very important disconnect that we see, that we grow up with certain ethical values and ethical standards, but we don't have the same in our workplaces. And this is why one of the most important indicators for me personally of the strength of your ethical culture is the ethics talk in the organization. Has it become legitimate? Has it become normal to talk about ethics in your organization? If you can normalize that, you will see that a big part of the battle has been won. Okay, so Vicky, let's take the two hands that were raised.
Thanks, Deon. First one is Fagida. If you can please unmute your mic and you can ask your question.
Great, thanks, Vicky. So my question goes back to the two types of culture that you referred to in terms of the extrinsic motivation and the intrinsic motivation. And it ties back to your observation that trust levels in the public sector are much lower than in the private sector. And if one takes an organization like the Public Investment Corporation, where we had the Impati Commission of Inquiry and the report earlier this year, and I guess it would be fair to say that the level of trust in an organization like that is probably very low, if it exists at all. And if they were to start on a journey of sort of rebuilding the trust of the public in the organization and belief in the ethics, would you say it's fair that you're going to have to go through a transitional phase where you first do sort of extrinsic motivation to actually just give the place a bit of a culture shock, and then sort of gradually transition to an intrinsic motivation? I mean, it'll be interesting to understand how you reset the ethical culture in an organization like that. Thank you.
Yeah. And I agree with you that very often it's a journey. Fakilia also at the start referred to this journey. That when things are very wrong, I think it is important to draw a big fat line in the sand and tell people, if you cross this line, it's not acceptable and you're out. The problem, however, with that approach is that it is typically an extrinsically motivated approach. And we soon find, and I can give you many more examples of organizations who tried that. And typically after a scandal, think about Siemens, the German company that got the biggest fine in the history of corporate fines in around 2008. They almost immediately appointed a whole lot of compliance officers to check what is going on. But within 18 months, they realized we don't have sufficient eyes, we don't have sufficient ears, we don't have enough hands to catch everybody. It's an impossible assignment. And therefore, we need to get some of our commitment to ethics inside our people. We need to start not only working with rules, but also starting working with values. The PIC is a very interesting example, and I'm quite familiar with that. And let me tell you, things are happening there. One of the biggest champions of ethics in South Africa is Dr. Roel Khoza, who was first the chairperson of Nedbank and is now the chair of the interim board at the PIC. And I know that he did draw that line in the sand. He's going after people who were corrupt inside the organization, and the organization is serious to improve its performance and to build that commitment to ethics. So I would say watch that space. In terms of turning organizations around, I watch that organization with great interest to see how they will come out on the other side. On the screen there, you can see, if you are interested in this interface between ethics and compliance, there's the Ethics and Compliance Handbook that is part of our Ethics Handbook series. You can just download it from tei.org.za. It's a free resource. Okay, Vicky, let's take the last question if we have time.
Yes, Rafiwe, you've had your hand up as well. So if you can please unmute your mic
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Deon, for the very insightful session this morning. So one quick question, just based on the research that you've done in the context of South Africa specifically, do you think this is an area that's receiving sufficient attention from those charged with governance? And if not, what can we do to get this as an agenda item on board meetings?
Okay, Rafilwe, I think it is getting a lot of attention, much more than it did at the time of King 1 or even King 2. Being in this field for the best part of 2.5 decades, I really see a growing trend. It is no coincidence that the very first 3 principles of King 4 deals explicitly with ethics. The first one starting by saying the governing body should lead ethically and effectively. Also in the very definition of corporate governance, as we find it in King 4, ethics is part of the definition, and the word ethical appears twice in the definition when it says that corporate governance is about ethical and effective leadership, and the first outcome thereof is an ethical culture. So yes, it is getting attention. Is it getting enough attention? No, it's not getting enough attention. And what I find, and it's a pity I did not run a poll with you this morning, because I probably could have demonstrated that my experience is that in groups of this nature, when I run a poll, about 50% of attendees tell me that in our organization, there's someone responsible for managing ethics effectively. I find it unthinkable. If you think ethics is important, you can't leave it to itself. If you think finance is important, you will have a finance director and a lot of finance managers. If you think marketing is important, you will have a marketing directors and a whole marketing division. If you think ethics is important and you do nothing, you are back to the Steinhoff category. You admit that there's something wrong, but you do nothing about it. And I would dearly like to see that percentage of organizations who take the management of ethics seriously increasing significantly. Okay, Vicky, back to you.
Deon, I think linked to what you just said now, there was a question from patients around where should the ethics office or officer be located in the organizational structure? I don't know, maybe if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, we always say there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. It must be placed in a position that is trusted, that has sufficient integrity, and that is seen as sufficiently independent. In other words, if bad news are coming through, it should not be throttled at that point. And that is why we see more and more that the ethics function does not only report to an executive like a CEO, more and more we see it reporting into the company secretariat. That is sort of a recent trend that we are seeing. But very often we see that dotted line going right up to the Social and Ethics Committee to just make sure that bad news does not get lost somewhere in translation through your reporting lines.
Thanks, John. And then I think one last question before we end, because I think it relates to the current environment in which we're in, and that was from Edmund. And Edmund says, thanks for the good presentation. There's so many noises right now. How would we view the ethical culture in SA and the world in a COVID era? And I think most importantly, his question was around what should we be doing differently post-COVID? And I think especially now in SA.
Yeah, I think especially all of us working from home, it's a big challenge for organizations. How do you keep your ethical culture healthy and strong when there's no interaction, where people can't see your example on a daily basis? And this is where communication becomes all important. I think the big danger that I see related to COVID is that we can go into a survival ethic where we say all that matters is survival. Everything else, including ethics, comes second. Well, I think that's a recipe for not recovering from this disaster. Ethics brought you to where you were, ethics and your competence, and ethics and your competence will get you through this crisis and will be important on the other side of this crisis as well.
Thank you so much, Deon. Thanks for joining us this morning. And I think from the comments we've seen, all the members and attendees really felt it was valuable, and it was also good, as Pumla has mentioned, that it was a great refresher as well to what to consider from an ethics perspective. I hope everyone enjoyed today's session. If you would like to chat to Deon further and discuss some of these aspects, or even have an in-house session with him, with your board and your organization, you can contact him via LinkedIn or through the Ethics Institute. You're welcome to email me and I can forward on your requests to them as well. So thank you for joining. Thank you again, Deon, and I will see everyone again next week, same time. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Go well.